Hey everybody, this is Grant Sherrod with Double Conscious, and today we're going to talk about a topic that comes up a lot in black community at least, and it's cultural appropriation. Except today we're going to talk about it in the way that you're never going to hear about it anywhere else on the on the internet. So while I share this real quick, everybody comment if you think Bruno Mars' Uptown Funk is cultural appropriation. Write down yes, no, and then where are you watching from? Let's see if this will share it. Alright, today we're going to talk about cultural appropriation with Bruno Mars in a way that no one wants to talk about it in, which is academically. And everybody, feel free to hit a respond on the, like a wow face whenever you learn something, and then also tag somebody if you want to have them learn about this so you can talk about it. The goal today is to give the academic values in which you can structure your point of view and actually talk about this so that we can actually have good dialogue on it. Alright. Cool. So let's get into it. Originally, popular cultural appropriation, the way we're going to talk about it normally, is white people are evil. Why can't they just have their own culture, their own style, and why do they always have to take it from black people or every other race? This is really what we're going to focus on, is when you have these popular discussions of it. So it's going to be bashing on white people. I'm going to say dominant culture because cultural appropriation happens everywhere. If you don't know what cultural appropriation is, basically it's borrowing or stealing something from another culture and then claiming it as your own. So when it comes to like Bruno Mars, there's the video out right now where it's saying that he takes everything from black culture and that America wants black culture from non-black artists, which that second half is a different claim. Today we're going to be talking about, does Bruno Mars actually take something from the black community? Is it cultural appropriation? And then what is cultural appropriation? So usually it's going to be bashing on the dominant culture, and it's also kind of a conversational power move. And this was where I was. And usually cultural appropriation is bad no matter what. Just bad all the time. All cultural appropriation is bad. White people shouldn't have dreadlocks, which you can. We're going to get into that now. So this is mostly how you're going to hear about it. Today we're going to talk about it in an academic sense. So academic cultural appropriation is split into three categories. One is going to be artifacts. The second is going to be stylistic, so it's different styles. And then the last is going to be how it's represented. So it's split into these. And artifacts are going to be something such as a totem pole that was stolen from a Native American tribe and then put into a museum. And it was stolen under false grounds, such as like a massacre or a raid by a colonialist. Or in London, they have the Egyptian exhibit, which was taken sort of illegally, and also these statues, the Benin Bronson statues. And all these things are going to be things that we're going to talk about in more detail on my Patreon account, which I'll include the link on after that so I can really give you some better visuals. But today I just want to give everybody the opportunity to know how to talk about these things. So the artifacts, they can be stolen, and this is bad faith, but there are laws. So if something is stolen in bad faith, an artifact, there are united global laws that will say if you've stolen this bad faith, you pay it back. If you've made a ton of money off of it, then you need to repay that as well. Some of the problems that occur from this, or if the country isn't around anymore, then who do you pay it back to? Or somebody stole an artifact, but then another person bought it in good faith. so do they have to give it back. And this happened with some book in Iceland, I believe. It's 10,000. It's the oldest printed book, and someone stole it somehow illegally, and then another person bought it legally. But then they negotiated, the person who bought it legally, with the Icelandic government to buy it back. And artifacts can be sort of what you would think like a bone flute. It can be a statue. It can also be different religious artifacts or ancestral artifacts as well. So there's stolen, there's laws, there's also reparations. Now, stylistically is usually where most people will say everything's bad, but I can say, like, right now that everything I'm wearing right now, and around this room I have tapestries, I have Bob Marley, this t-shirts are not from my culture at least, and not really from anybody's. This Rude Raksha that I wear around is Hindu. The food that I like is Indian, Chinese, spaghetti, and all of this is stylistic appropriation. I'm taking the style of food, the style of clothes, the style of hair from Jamaica, India, Italy, China, and it's fine. And this is the part where people might get left off a little bit, is because everybody appropriates style from everybody else, and it's not really considered harmful because great ideas come from this. Our life would be really boring and colorless if we weren't sharing and exchanging ideas. And also in a world market today, it's almost nearly impossible to have cultures not shifting and merging, and I'm black and white, so in one sense, like, cultures merge, they come together, we just have a better and more enriching life together. So styles, though, is going to be different styles of music, which this happens, and say people stole rock and roll from the blues and all that. So music and then food, and everybody does this. You might say, like, well, I do it respectfully, I don't claim it as my own. I went to an Indian wedding and I wore a sari. That's fine. But it is cultural appropriation, but not all cultural appropriation is bad, which is something that we have to tear down a little bit. So, where we're getting into the harms is, this is where the harms can be, and they can be subtle harms, and then they can be explicit. So the one that I like to go to as far as subtle, or let's start with explicit because that'll be easier. So let's say someone does blackface. That would be a white person, someone not in that culture. I'm going to say white actually because it'll come back around in a second to this claim. So a white person in the time would paint their face black and then present themselves and represent themselves as a black person in their skits or in their plays, and they would call this blackface. So this is an explicit harm of one culture appropriating what they think of the other culture and then representing them in the way that they want. This is pretty much morally objectionable. Like, we don't want to do that. I don't want to do that to other people. I don't want them doing it to me, especially if it's on an entire race. That's a harmful representation. People that can wear headdresses, usually that one's going to be kind of along the representative sort of form, because you're representing, and it depends on how the context is. It's pretty hard to pass off that you are enjoying wearing this traditional Indian headdress as fashion or style, but you could. But if you're going to represent it for something else, like people do it at raves, which are kind of like, a rave is supposed to enjoy the music, and like music is sort of dancing music, which gets into a long line of kind of like sensual pleasure and that kind of thing. Not exactly what the traditional headdress trying to pay homage to the great spirit in the earth was about in the beginning. So those are the explicit ones. Some of the subtle harms, these ones are kind of fun. Because it could be something like the Moana costume. Now, Disney put in a lot of effort to actually make the Moana costume pretty traditional and accurate to Polynesian dress. And stylistically, it's a character, so it's not necessarily representing it in a wrong way. It's also not representing it at all. It is exactly what it is. And if a kid probably can't do a representation. If they are they going to reasonably believe that there are talking coconuts in Polynesia? Probably not. Are they actually representing something within the culture? Maybe it's uncomfortable, but it's not necessarily wrong if they act like the culture or the character from that culture. So if you, obviously you could make it offensive if you use their imagination, but it's pretty innocent hearing a kid. The subtle harm of this might be, though, that they think that every single Polynesian person is going to follow whatever religion is portrayed in Moana or dressed this way, when there might be people who don't follow the same religion within that culture, or not everybody from Polynesia is from one island. There are many different islands within Polynesia. It could be Tonga, Samoa, Fiji, etc. So subtle harm of that is just kind of lumping all of Polynesia together. But we can fix that through education, and that's just one geography lesson. Not a big deal. But what comes in with music a lot of the time is like, in music, like half of music is copying everything. So when we think about what is black music, people are going to start off with gospel, really the slave songs, right? The blues, let's say jazz, which turned into, it sort of turned into bebop, which then went to Motown to kind of give the opposite side, the more conservative side, which gave rise to Stevie Wonder, and then James Brown. And then James Brown was the power soul, I guess is what you call it. And then that soul movement gave rise to funk. And along those lines, we think that's entirely just black culture all the time, when it's not exactly black culture. The progression of black music is actually pretty interesting, and it has to do a little bit with slavery, but I'm not going to use this to bash on white people. This isn't the point. So we have black people from Africa. In Africa, they have a lot of rhythms, so that sort of carries over. But one standard that a lot of black people say, like during Black History Month, is like not all black people are from the same, or from all different cultures, all different backgrounds. But then when we talk about the progression of how music comes from different parts of Africa, and even in the Caribbean, Afro-Cubans from the slave trade there, and even in Brazil, and some of their beats, and then moving into New Orleans, like, oh, now all of a sudden, like, black culture is all of that. So we have these mixing standards, and really what people do with that, in my opinion, is they use these moving standards of, like, we're not all the same, to actually, yeah, we are the same, in order to bash on the dominant culture and to keep conversational power. And this isn't really what we want to do. We actually want to have, in a conversation, you want to have consistent standards. So I'm not going to treat every single black community as just black. That's what slavery tried to do, and pretty well did, is take away these nationalities. But anyway, so when the slaves were brought to Cuba, you have like Cuban son music, which, let me grab these. So these are called claves, and in Cuban son music, there's a rhythm that's going to do 2 and then 3. So 2 hits and then 3, and they're spaced out. So the first one would be like boom da 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 da. Right. So it's not your traditional where in African music you have a bell. So there'd just be a straight 4/4. And then you would have different rhythms on top of that. Usually, this is going to be a technical term, but like a 2/3. So it'd be like ba ba da da ba 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 ba. Right. So you can also do you do 2 3 boom bum 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 bum, and this has a swing to it. The notes don't fall exactly on the cadence. And this is Cuban son music. You can go and check it out. Now, the clave, before I move on a little bit, is prevalent in all popular rap music and all popular in all rap music today. If you listen to Effin' Problems by A$AP Rocky, you're going to hear the bass line go like boom, 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 boom. Once you hear this, you will not stop hearing it in all popular music that you hear. And this came from Cuba, which is a mix of Latin Americans and settlers, colonialists, imperialists, and black people. Now, the culture there got to develop by kind of accelerated from slavery about 100 years. So now we're in about 1900s, and there was 1920s to be precise, and there was a musician called W.C. Handy, and he went to Cuba, and he took this beat, and then he brought it to New Orleans, which is where we think jazz originates from. So he went there, and he has this song, I think it's called Chicago Blues. I'll have to check it out. This is something that I would include on the Patreon as actual link to the music so you can hear all this. So, he went to New Orleans, he brought this sort of swing, and now has this push, this Latin push on it, which then gave the blues music, which is more boom, boom, pa, boom, boom, pa, boom, boom, pa, the gospel groove, to this now like push sense. So it'd be like ta 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 ta, and this changed and merged into jazz music as well as sort of the marching and the environment around it. But then if we take a step back, so in New Orleans there's jazz, but before that there was the house slaves that were trained on classical instruments to play at different events, and also the for the plantation owners, slave owners. So the slaves learned classical music, but they also played like blues folk songs, right? And then you have the influence from Cuba mixing into there. So it's really classical music from Western music meeting blues, which comes, from Africa, the pentatonic scale. And then that is merged this into jazz, and then this swing from Cuba. So jazz, and if you think about New Orleans, there's a huge different population of mixing from Creole Haitian people from the Caribbean. So there's this huge melting pot of Cuban music from the Caribbean, and then there's jazz, which originates combining sort of classical and blues into jazz, like playing classical themes but still using African rhythms, polyrhythms, soloing, different instrumentation, combining major and minor scales, and playing around with the chords and improvising, which is a big part of African drum circles, is that everyone takes their sort of turn improvising and communicating what they have inside in a circle, in a drum circle. So this tradition carries on through it. So there is this sort of melting pot, which does become black. So then jazz goes to Motown, or blues, sort of like electric blues, jump blues. And then we're just going to fast forward Motown, and then James Brown and funk. And Stevie Wonder is around this Motown era, and this was a time where, this is actually a really cool time, because this time where Motown tried to tame the wildness and improvisation of jazz music so that could actually sell to the white market in segregated America. The executive of Motown Records was Berry Gordy. And a lot of it from the British bands, like the Beatles, like while they loved all this music, they would play it, and then people would think it was their own music, in a sense. But the difference in the beginning, which we have to think is, which I'll get into with fair use and cultural appropriation, is the motive behind it. They're trying to take this and not be a representative of it, but they're trying to use the style, and they're also trying to pay homage. They're not trying to transform it or change it. They like it exactly as it is, and they're trying to copy it. And if you think about anybody, when they learn anything new, they're just going to copy it straight out. Like when you first learn an instrument in a song, you're going to learn it exactly as it is, pretty much, and then later, as you develop, it's going to change. So anytime someone starts doing something new, I think it's more of a copying issue of how people learn rather than being offensive. And what happened from there is that the Motown artists Stevie Wonder was on this tour and went to the UK and started meeting with different white people, and they became exposed. They saw this conservative glamour, and they started to adopt and change their perceptions of Motown music, and they call Motown the music of integration. So it's not so much cultural appropriation on behalf of these other bands. While they do use the style as much as it's new, they're trying to pay homage. They're respecting it, and a lot of it sort of brought these bands of the UK. Mr. Postman is the song the Beatles covered by the Marvelettes. And in America, the civil rights movement actually started using Motown to have integrated theaters. So now people weren't going to shows unless they were in integrated venues. So was cultural appropriation bad at that time? Like, it actually led to some pretty cool things. But what did happen with James Brown in the funk era, and really this is 60s, and then James Brown has a song on Black and I'm Proud, and he really incorporated the African element of coming in hard on the one. So if I'm counting a rhythm like 1, 2, 3, 4, I'm going to hit on the one like pa, 2, 3, 4, pa, 2, 3, 4, pa. And you hear James Brown come in like 1, 2, 3, 4, good God, 2, 3, 4, good God. Coming in on the one hard, and really the band's carrying everything. The rhythms, the guitar is not melodic at all. It's pure rhythm. A lot of it, you have the horns, but again, horns come from New Orleans in the sort of jazz era, and horns were loud and bright, so it's not necessarily it's African as much as like a horn is going to carry within a bar where people are eating, laughing, and drinking and playing pool. Whereas like maybe a flute is not going to carry in that venue. So it was more of the space and the circumstances that made jazz sort of come out with this particular instruments. And it changes as technology changes as well. So funk, though, get back to it, is James Brown really tried to make this sort of unapologetically black music, something that the black community could rally around and really make their own, that white people couldn't necessarily copy because these rhythms are more intuitive. And if you study musicology and how it affects our minds, like rhythm is more of a learned thing. In flamenco music, they go by 12, so it'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, or 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 1, 2. You can count it however you want. But not going to be very intuitive. Sometimes in Indian music, the cadence is 10. So it'd be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And that's not going to feel like a good beat to most of us here. So rhythm is really something you're growing up with, and this is something that in the black community you'd be able to do a little bit better from exposure. So funk really became popular, especially James Brown in South Africa during apartheid, and a bunch of bands started imitating James Brown and appreciated how African its beats were, the rhythm of it, the dancing was now wild. And I think James Brown, as a side note, really made it not just okay to be a performer and a black man, but be like proud of like being a man that's black. Like, you're not just a black man, you're a man that is black. And that sort of pride, you know. And he really kind of was a staple. They say after Martin Luther King was shot that James Brown was the most powerful man. But his goal, maybe not, was really to try to get funk, was this sort of overly rhythmic sort of music. And that branched off. And Herbie Hancock, Stevie Wonder, is here now because he's saying Bruno Mars today that Bruno Mars is stealing funk music from black people. When Bruno Mars is from Puerto Rico, which I'm not saying is similar to Cuba, but really a lot of these Caribbean sort of grooves come to America. And if we're going to like sort of play this thing where the Caribbean black people are the same, then we're going to have to play the same standards that Caribbean Latin America is the same as well. And jazz and a lot of these funk Latin beats that we're using are Afro-Cuban in nature and developed from this mix of Western music, blues music, Cuban song, and was really brought by W.C. Handy to New Orleans, and that spread everywhere during the diaspora and then the Great Migration, which is how a lot of things move. Brahms came to America and became popular because of a huge German diaspora, which is a movement of people. So with Stevie Wonder, I mean, if I can take a shot at him, Stevie Wonder is sort of his influence was Donny Hathaway. So if you ever get a chance, go listen to Donny Hathaway and then see how Stevie Wonder takes influence and sort of copies his style. And then Bruno Mars is taking from funk, and he's not really doing funk that much, and he's also not the only one writing it. But when you're jamming with a bunch of people, which is the story, usually you don't jam with people and lay out sheet music of original things. Usually when you jam with people that are in the familiar genre, you play like a 12-bar blues, which is a pretty standard jam for new people, or you do like a pop progression, which is like a G to a D to an E minor, C, and then you expand on that. So yeah, I can see how they organize a lot of these things and put it in, and there is a comparison that I'll include in Patreon where we go through and see how similar it is, Uptown Funk. But as far as like cultural appropriation of funk, like funk music is not an artifact, really, right? It's not really, I mean, it's not like a reparation. Stylistically, like we all benefit from the styles. Bruno Mars isn't representing funk music today. There's plenty of funk bands out there that get much more attention. Like maybe he's popular, but like really it's not original funk. Funk probably isn't going to come back. He's just using it. And if anything, it's more just like taking something old, which people are in this new phase of. Instead, we have the technology now to make like a guitar string that's 2,000 feet long and underwater in liquid nitrogen, but we still just want to put like dubstep drums and like old sounding music together. So like there's this phase, I guess, today where we just like to take old things and put them over new things. And not that original or transformative, in my opinion, considering the technology we have. So anyway, but where I want to go from here is, so stylistically, I think this is where Bruno Mars and Stevie Wonder come in. Like funk is just a style. So whatever is going on with the copyright on this, or if Bruno Mars is original or cultural appropriating black music, which again, black is a huge term, and like if we want to make it consistent and say like, well, what part black? Like what cultures actually led to the creation of funk music, and it can't just be African, like what part of that? No one knows. We just want to bash on the dominant culture, right? Which is also kind of this double standard, because we do have bands that like, when sampling came out, there's, I think it's Sugar Hill Gang with the song, what is it? I can't remember. Apache. They come out as like, hey Tonto, jump on it, jump on it. Tonto is from the Lone Ranger, which means stupid in Spanish, and they're wearing headdresses and being like Native Americans, like explicitly, but it seems to be okay for a minority group to like do it to another one. And then also when sampling came out, it was making a lot of money and hip hop was new. We also like can't do that. Didn't really get into the whole like copyright, and if you're taking or stealing from other people, just because we wanted to get this going, it was new, it was selling, it was popular. So we have these mixed standards. And if I can go to like DJing and sound systems, do a little bit side. Sound systems come from Jamaica. Sound systems. And what would happen is there would be like parties where people would bring a bunch of speakers out onto their tapes, and they'd bring out the records. There'd be a DJ booth, record spinning, big blaring subwoofers, and people would come in together. And then they would take the B-side of a track that had no vocals on it, and they would dance to it. And this is sort of where dancehall came about. And they would actually, reggae music started from like these ska beats, these island beats were too fast, so they would try to half time and slow it down. Now from Jamaica, a lot of Jamaicans went to Brooklyn and to Harlem, which is where hip-hop is originated. They brought these sound systems in this culture. So then you would have people spinning records in the traditional sound system party, and then you would have somebody get the mic and then talk and say, just, there's always kind of like a cultural sort of thing, like we like a black guy that can talk well over music, or just kind of talk smooth over music. It's just something we like. And that's from Jamaica, the sound system's talking over it, using the instrumental. Now Sir Mix-a-Lot, Grandmaster Flash, these original DJs did transform this, though, I will say, because they figured out how to make an endless loop by using a crayon on one part of the vinyl, and then letting it spin for a certain amount of times, and then rewinding it to the crayon spot, and then letting it go, creating this infinite loop. Which that does sort of transform from the sound system, but really did they take that from the culture today, which is basically what we call sampling. And that's from Jamaica. And if all black people aren't the same, then yeah, there's some cultural appropriation going on there. Is it bad? No, it's awesome. Like, it was just another way that cultures merged together and made something entirely new. Which, if we look at the difference between blues and like rock and roll today, it's pretty different. Like, you know, give it enough time, like I said in the beginning, you learn something, you kind of just copy it exactly. But then eventually you start making it your own, and I do think we see this happening in rock music. Like, I play the guitar, I know when there's a blues lick going on, but if you look at the difference between Lightning Hopkins and Dimebag Darrell, there's a pretty big gap in the difference in the way rock and blues are played, even though it's the same scale. So, the sound systems in Jamaica definitely were something that we had to talk about. I'm going to clear a little bit of this up. So when it comes to some cultural appropriation that I think is bad, that's representing these groups in a bad way, Herbie Hancock has his song Watermelon Man. And when he was originally talking about it in his autobiography, he did this originally just as it was, and he was like thinking about the man that would come around and sell watermelons, and there was this song he would sing. So he thought about that memory as a child, tried to put it into a song. And he had to think, he was thinking about the stereotype, because a pickaninny, which if you don't know what it is, look it up online, pretty racist. It's like a little black child eating a big watermelon. And this was circulating around at his time in the 1960s, after he got out of Miles Davis's band. So he was thinking about doing this song, Watermelon Man. He put it out, and it was a huge hit, but he was like, is that racist to myself? But then he's like, what's wrong with watermelons? And then he just did it anyway. He's like, there's nothing wrong with watermelons. So sometimes this is more of a double conscious sort of question where you have to take into consideration your own blackness to not try to be racist towards yourself. Or even if there is no racism anymore, you still think that you, in a way that is racist and downpressive to yourself. Side note, so it was Watermelon Man. And when he did a remix, this was when he formed his own band. I can't remember the name. Wanda Ishi? I can't remember what it is. His own band. And this was 70s, where like after the Civil Rights Act and this kind of Marcus Garvey resurgence, Marcus Garvey said we should all go back to Africa. We have the Nation of Islam and the Moorish temple. The Moors, which the Moors believe that all black people originated from Egypt. Not true, but that we should go back to Africa, into Egypt. And then you also have Bob Marley, the Jamaicans, with the Rastafarians saying go back to Africa, back to Ethiopia, blah, blah, blah. So as a way of him getting involved, he started to study the ethnomusicality of African music, and his band actually adopted all Swahili names when they met with these people and actually went to Africa to explore the rhythms, the music, the culture that brought with it. And he did a lot of research and work with ethnomusicologists on pygmy music, which he uses on his remix in the 1973 version of Watermelon Man in the intro. So you can see there's a lot of work that he did to make sure that when he's representing this, like, it is as it's supposed to be, and it's transforming and it's adding to this. It's using this in a pretty like well thought out way that is supposed to be meaningful and shows that he cares and is bringing this attention of how cool, rhythmic, and melodic African music is, and kind of establishing that, like, wait a second, like, Africa isn't this sort of this philosophy question of African Americanism. Is like, what humanities are there in Africa? We kind of think of Africa as this wasteland where there's no art or contributions intellectually, and he's bringing that over here, which did help a lot. And so he brought that, did a lot of work, and I don't think there's any subtle harms that came out of that. People aren't going to say, like, they're going to become interested, like I went and researched pygmy music after I heard that. a part that's gonna sound bad is when Arcade Fire, I think its song is Everything Now. If you go to 2 minutes and 36 seconds, you'll hear them using that same flute in their song, but it really has, the video that they shoot it in is in a desert. The song has nothing to do, it doesn't really have anything African rhythmic in it other than maybe a 4/4, and it's like overly emphasizing the melody, which is more Western than African. So in this way, like, yeah, they're really just taking this for like some sort of like flavor for the song just to make it okay, where like I feel like that's a subtle harm where like people just say like this is just a melody, when really the Pygmies and like these African sort of melodies have a long history and tradition that Herbie Hancock was trying to reconnect and bring to America. Now it's sort of watered down to just to be like, yeah, this is something that sounds good. Not exactly something that I would consider good cultural appropriation, because it really doesn't have anything to do with the history or the meaning of why they put it in the song other than it seems to sound cool on that. So we have this representation war versus style war. You kind of got that. Now when it comes to, a lot of this is going to be talking about copying, right? They're saying like Bruno Mars copied the Uptown or Funk You Up song from this other band, and he took it from like Kool and the Gang and different rhythm parts from that. And when we get into copying with music, it's pretty tough, but Bruno Mars is by far like the least of the offenders, and like the biggest offender is Kanye West. And Kanye and fair use. So fair use is sort of the Western way of talking about copyright. Fair use of music is for teaching, parody, irony, satire, some sort of commentary, or you can always pay and have someone like Tainted Love was originally a 50s sort of jump blues song that Soft Cell took, transformed, and then Marilyn Manson took and transformed it even further, and then I think it's Levi jeans maybe, they just use the beep beep in their advertisement. That's what the bump bump, that's the most important part of the song to people. So with fair use, you kind of have parodies and these other ones, or education, commentary, teaching, yeah, these sort of things. So when Kanye West has his song that start out with Diamonds of Sierra Leone, you can check out this. Kanye West has this thing about supposedly about blood diamonds, so he's trying to make this commentary on blood diamonds, but this he uses Shirley Bassey's song "Diamonds Are Forever" as a backing track, and uses videos to sort of make a commentary or to teach about blood diamonds in Africa. But if you look at all the lyrics in the song, it has nothing to do with blood diamonds at all. He just liked the beat and then used fair use, and there's quotes of him being like, "It's fair use, baby," using fair use to claim this track on his song. Now, with anything in business, really there's fair use and then there's money. So he couldn't argue this very well, but he couldn't also say that Shirley Bassey's sales would be hurt by this. Because Shirley Bassey fans aren't necessarily going to flock to go listen to Kanye West. However, a lot of Kanye West fans went back and listened to Shirley Bassey, so she actually gained financially. Does it mean that Kanye West stole this the right way and actually used this the correct way? No. And the problem I have with Kanye is that he always says he's so original and transformative, but then he just straight up copies and uses the rules to do something not original. And which brings me to my next part, where he has this song "Heartless," and it was one of the, I think, MTV's or like VH1's like music video of the year, and it used a video style called rotoscope, which was popular in the 70s, and you'll kind of notice it if you've ever seen like Adult Swim, how they have all these different animations that flip into each other. And basically it's a style of, they record the person doing everything, and then they go back over and they paint or animate over the character. So it would be like me right now, and then they would go and re-record it and paint over me so I look like this painted image. And Kanye basically took this, he said he was a huge fan of American pop, and he wanted people, this series by this one director in the 80s, and you check on Patreon, then you can see all these links that'll be a little bit more condensed, but I don't have enough time to really show and stop every second. I want to give you guys the ability to kind of be able to talk about the values associated with copying cultural appropriation. So there's a topic called rotoscope, which is animation in this style, and it came from American pop. And literally, if you go frame by frame, you can really see how one scene in American pop is basically the same thing as a Heartless video. But Kanye West before this said he was coming out with an entirely new music video style that's never before seen, that is going to be transformative to how every music video is going to be made, and then he straight up changed that and just said, oh, now I'm teaching about American pop. The movie series, the video that uses rotoscope, it actually parallels the scene, almost exactly copying it, just with black people. So, as far as like copyright, like really it's just about the money, and he's not transforming the music. He's not taking it rotoscope to any new level. He's just saying that he's an originator, and people think it's new and original when really it's been around for 30 years. They just haven't seen it before, and I doubt that a lot of people went back and actually found out American pop and then saw the similarities on that. So does Kanye West cultural appropriate from this director, like whatever, or steal from this? Like, I'm gonna say yeah, this is bad. So really, when it comes down to copyright, like Weird Al does parodies. When I use his music to talk about and compare these things, I'm educating, I'm commenting, I'm not claiming it as my own. Even most of these, some of these arguments are arguments that I heard in class or from other people or the internet, but I'm organizing and transforming it into a way that I'm presenting it to you now, that it would be different than if someone else did. So, what happens with fair use really is a transformative nature, and I have a different video that I'm going to do next week on copying related, like a whole thing just based on what is transformative in music, and some good bands that do it and some bad bands that do it. And you'll notice Led Zeppelin, for me, consistently really transforms black music to new heights, and there's actually a subcategory of cultural appropriation where you take a motif but you don't use anything really of that culture. You really indoctrinate it entirely into your culture. So it's really just a motif of some of these songs, like the lyrics, and then they make When the Levee Breaks, and that's like way different from the original song. But then you have bands like Creedence Clearwater Revival, which covers Heard It Through the Grapevine, not exactly changing it. They keep the same drums, same melody, same guitar, same everything, same vocal sort of pitch and inflections everywhere, which may be more of a way of like, hey, we're not going to try and change the music. We like it the way it is already. We already like it. So there's two ways to look at it, and I think Creedence Clearwater Revival, John Fogerty had his heart in the right place and really did appreciate Marvin Gaye. But if we're talking about the value of transformativeness, not so much. So Bruno Mars, Uptown Funk, is it transformative? Is it? I'm gonna say no. He didn't take it to any new level. He did do this sort of like, let's flash back to the past and bring this back. But as far as transformative, I'm gonna say no. But I'm also gonna say like cultural appropriation on it, I'm also gonna say no. Because if he... cultural appropriation, he's not representing it in a bad way. He's pretty accurate exactly to how it is. He's not making a joke out of the sort of zoot suits that people used to wear. He's actually pretty proud, and they actually make the costumes that he's in the video sound good. He takes the chorus and everything pretty seriously and accurate. So as a way of representing it, like, yeah, he does a pretty good job matching it, sort of in the same way that Herbie Hancock does. And when you hear about them talk about how much they enjoy the music, then yeah, I think they actually do a pretty good job stylistically doing it. He also doesn't claim to own funk. He's never declared himself the king of funk, right? So I'm going to let Bruno Mars off the hook from an academic perspective. I think we can use Bruno Mars to make a whole bunch of claims bashing on media for only promoting black music not played by black musicians, but a lot of music is shared anyway. There are some things that maybe we can consider, such as Stevie Ray Vaughan, not exactly the most transformative blues guitar player, and actually is now representing blues guitar, even though he didn't really contribute anything overly transformative in the genre. He did a lot of covers of Jimi Hendrix and other black artists. So as much as I love him, sort of just cultural appropriated. And but the last claim that people were talking about is that people are only going to listen to Bruno Mars and see him as funk. But there's this thing called a continental claim, which is a sweeping claim, such as music like this: "Love the life you live and live the life you love," by Bob Marley. You hear this and you're like, yeah, I feel that. I like this. Who is this guy? Bob Marley. And then you go on and you have this continental claim, sort of a broad, sweeping claim. And this is your beginning. It shouldn't be your ending. You shouldn't just be like, yeah, whoever that guy is, he's cool. Then you go in, you analyze it, you break it down. You'd be like, okay, well, Uptown Funk says from these obscure bands and groups, like I've never heard of James Brown. I've never heard of Stevie Wonder. And then people go and listen to them. I tell my students that I teach guitar, like, oh yeah, this song is influenced by Kool and the Gang. Like, you probably already know some of the songs, or Earth, Wind, and Fire. They're like, I don't know that. And then you play it, and they do know it. So it's really just an educational problem. Like, we just educate people. But if Bruno Mars is bringing the topic of funk up, then more people are going back in time and learning about this. So I think it's not bad, and I think actually he's doing sort of what the Beatles did for the Marvelettes when they covered Mr. Postman, and people were like, wait, they think this is our song. And then they announced it, and then they got a tour. Berry Gordy set the tour of Motown Records into the UK, so then everybody knew who the Marvelettes were, and that introduced Stevie Wonder. That's how he got his big break, and then Marvin Gaye and the Temptations through Motown Records. So was it bad, or is it helping out? I think it's actually sort of helping out. So now when you make your arguments sort of about cultural appropriation, like dreadlocks are just stylistic. There's a different conversation on, do like people who wear dreadlocks who are white get different treatment than people who wear dreadlocks and they're black. But that's not about cultural appropriation. That's just about straight up racism. That's just about stereotypes of people, like in cognitive models, which we can talk about another time. But it's not necessarily about cultural appropriation. That has more to do with privilege and transcendency and existentialism. It's messy, right? But for now, I would try to say, like, when you want to talk about these things, try to put it in terms of, is this an artifact? Is funk music an artifact? Or is it just a style? And if this artist is doing it, is it going to lead to subtle harms or explicit harms? To which I don't think he is. So, that's it for now. If you want to check out the Patreon channel, I'll include a link on it as well. People that jump in late, please comment, leave questions. I'll come back and answer it after the video is done. And I'll include some links in the Patreon feed and page when I do this, so I can show you all the comparisons of the references that I meant. Hope you learned something. If you want to give it one more wow sign in a comment, I'd really appreciate it. And if you have questions, we'll come back, check it out. And yeah, it's cultural appropriation in a pretty useful way, and I apply it to music, and hope you learned something. So next time, check out Double Conscious, like the page, share the page, and 2 weeks, next Saturday, I'll do a live stream on Patreon that we can all and listen to some of these music, now that we have this frame of how we can talk about this. If you have a response, you can film a video and tag me in it. I'll watch it and I'll respond too. So everybody, thank you. Double Conscious. Always remember to think twice. Things aren't always what they seem. And try to go deeper with the information that you seek. So I will see you in 2 weeks on Patreon, or I'll see you in 2 weeks, next 2 Tuesdays, again, where we'll talk about the transformative nature and how human beings evolved in their minds to copy and what we should do about that philosophically. So, until next time, I'll see you later.